Okay, chapter 13, brain and cranial nerves. Let's go. And this is the short version, just as a reminder. So some things I'm not talking about because I feel, have covered in sufficient depth in other chapters and or in lab. Okay? So, talking about the brain. Big part of the central nervous system. The other part is the spinal cord, which is the previous chapter. We have already kind of examined a lot of the anatomy of the brain when we did our dissection last semester. And it is basically the control center for our body. And we're going to be investigating some of those regions and things that are controlled by our brain, including our emotions, breathing, hunger, coordination, all sorts of neat things. And so, starting here, regions of the brain. You definitely need to know the basic regions of the brain. You have the brainstem, and the brainstem is made up of basically three major regions. You have seen the pons before. You've seen the medulla oblongata. The mesencephalon is just basically a different term for the midbrain, where we find, for example, let me see, I'm trying to remember, our cerebral peduncles, etc., like moving up into the brain itself. Cerebellum is kind of separate, and it looks like a little tiny version of the cerebrum. That sits kind of posterior to the cerebrum. And this is, posterior to the cerebellum, Cerebrum, I was right. Anyway, so this organ is really important in our movement, in our balance, in our posture. So even when you're not thinking about any of these particular things, your cerebellum is constantly monitoring and helping you to, most of the time at least, make nice, graceful movements that are coordinated. Simple things like if you're sitting in your chair with your legs crossed, you may not actually think about, okay, I have to uncross my legs first, put my feet down, and then I can stand up. Cerebellum helps coordinate all of those activities. Even if it's mostly an unconscious process on your part, the cerebellum is actively working to make it a nice, hopefully fluid, smooth motion, unless you're a little bit inclined to be klutzy. That can happen. Okay, and then we have what's called the diencephalon, and this incorporates some structures that we have seen when we dissected the brain, including the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Two structures we really didn't talk about was the subthalamus and epithalamus, and we will review those. So, for example, in the epithalamus, we'll find the pineal gland. So you've seen it, we just didn't use that term before. In the epithalamus region, we have that gland. And then cerebrum is the biggest portion of our brain, and this is large, heavily folded, lots of gray matter. And so the more gray matter you have, the more ability you have to have higher reasoning and functioning and control over your body, conscious thought, the ability to think of abstract things. So it's a really awesome structure we have there. And then branching right off of the brain itself are the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system because that definition, do you remember the definition or how we know if a nerve is a peripheral nerve or a nerve in the central nervous system? Yeah, it branches off of the central nervous system. So in the brain itself, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. What does it say, 10? Oh, no, 2 from the cerebrum, 10 from the brainstem. My bad. So total of 12 pairs. And so here's this picture. You will see this picture on your quizam next week, February 8th. You will be expected to be able to identify any of those 12 cranial nerves, and note they have an actual name and a Roman numeral associated with it. And so you should know both. And the information will be in a table, so you can just kind of match typically the way we do it in class. So you are expected to know all of your 12 cranial nerves. I'm not asking you to know all of the functions, okay? Other information that I think is fairly important over here. Olfactory tract, I mean, we did that when we dissected the brain. Optic chiasm, where there's two optic nerves cross, and some of those nerves will desiccate, and if you remember what that means is they cross over to the opposite side of the brain. And so we did a lab, and we kind of talked about how that happens. So then our pituitary gland, our mammillary body looks different than it does on the sheep brain. So in a human, almost like we have two round structures. In the sheep brain, it was kind of a weird, kind of almost V-shaped rounded end structure. Remember that? That's what it looked like in the sheep brain. And then it goes over just the major regions. So pons is part of the brainstem. We have our medulla oblongata. So just know the structures in this picture. It will be the exact picture, I promise. I always use the same picture. So that is your only identification for this chapter. This picture here is just showing you kind of a close-up of the brainstem, kind of taken out, so you can't see, the brain's gone, just the brainstem. So some things look a little weird because this portion here is usually kind of hidden inside the cerebrum. And we were only able to see it when we dissected the brain, and we bisected it right down the middle. Do you remember that? And so when we did that and we opened up the brain, we saw that little round structure, and we call that the thalamus. Well, that's really the connection between the two sides of the thalamus that we saw, because we couldn't see the entire structure. So this is a nice picture because it kind of pulls it out, and so you can see how it should look. And it also shows other structures we have already seen, like the cerebral peduncles, our pons, and our brainstem. So this is just kind of a nice picture to see outside of the brain itself. So here we see our pineal body. So this is kind of like a view of the side and kind of showing the posterior view, because we can see our colliculi. Remember those? The superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, which were important structures that you needed to know when we did our brain dissection. So we're going to start by talking a little bit more about the brainstem, what's important there, important structures or functions that we have. So I know we did this one slide, so I'll try to go quickly, but we know that the brainstem, basically at the end of the brainstem, it's continuous and continues on with the spinal cord. Okay, and then it is connected to the cerebrum. So it's kind of like this middle ground, essentially, where information from the cerebrum passes through the brainstem and then down the spinal cord. And we typically have, in this area, we have nerve tracts that are both ascending and descending. So ascending up to the brain. Oh, come on, don't do that. To the brain, and then descending down the spinal cord. Okay. And so some of the things the medulla oblongata is important for, notice it's kind of regulating and involved with vital life functions. So heart rate, the diameter of your blood vessel. So if you change the diameter of your blood vessel, what are you also changing? Blood pressure, exactly, which is really important. Respiration, swallowing, very important. Have you ever not been able to swallow? It doesn't feel good. I'll tell you, I went in for an upper endoscopy once where they put the tube down your throat. And one of the first things they do, before they even drug you, is they put this numbing gel in the back of your throat. And so you start to you can't swallow, and it's this most awful, uncomfortable feeling because you feel like you're going to start gagging or something. And then they shove this thing in your mouth and the tube goes down. Ugh. They didn't drug me enough. I was awake the whole time. Don't do that. So swallowing, a really important function. Throwing up, vomiting, hiccuping. So you can thank your medulla oblongata for the hiccuping that's occurring, which is basically a spasm in your diaphragm, okay? Coughing and sneezing. The pyramids that you find in the medulla oblongata, this is carrying descending nerve tracts. That's all, okay? So nerve tracts that are traveling down to the spinal cord. And so this is where we have nerve fibers that desiccate and cross over. And we talked about this last time. So information from the right side of the brain, some of those nerve fibers are going to cross over to the left side and travel down the left side of the spinal cord in a descending nerve tract. And the same thing for the left side of your brain, it's going to desiccate over to the right side and travel down descending tracts on the right side of the spinal cord. And vice versa for ascending information, it's going to cross over to the opposite side when it hits the medulla oblongata. Okay, then we have the structures called olives, and they're kind of these round, oval-shaped structures, and they're helpful, if you notice right here, regulating balance, coordination, and also some functions in the inner ear. I'm going to back up super quick. Let's see, can we find the olives in this picture here? So it's just kind of on the sides of the brainstem in the medulla oblongata region, okay? And then in the pyramids, backing up 1 second here, where's our pyramid? Okay, here's the pyramids. So these regions right here, those are the pyramids, and this is where those fibers desiccate. So if we can kind of imagine there's nerve fibers here, they're going to go over to this side, and the nerve fibers on this side will cross in that region and travel to the opposite side. Okay, so make sure you remember the term here. These fibers crossing to the opposite side. Okay, a little bit more about the medulla oblongata. When we talk about nuclei, remember this is talking about a group of cell bodies. This is gray matter. And so in the cerebrum, we have a general consensus that, the outside heavily folded area is all gray matter, the cerebral cortex. But within the cerebrum itself, there are other little areas of gray matter. And so we call those nuclei. And so you even have that in the brainstem. So 3 groups of nuclei in the medulla oblongata. And so you need to at least know the groups, like what are they controlling here? So the first one, autonomic, so we know that's happening automatically. So nuclei that controls visceral activities. So when you hear visceral, what does that make you think of? Your body, like organs, so the activities of the organs within our body, the viscera, okay? And so specifically, here's the reticular formation, and this will pop up multiple times. I don't know if you remember, I told you that it's kind of like this long, thin, kind of like a pencil or something, of gray matter that passes through several regions of the brainstem. So the reticular formation will pop up a couple times with functions. And so vital automatic functions. So for example, you have a cardiovascular sensor that helps with your heart rate and how hard the heart contracts. Now, how hard this heart contracts can directly control how much blood is pumping through your body, how quickly, and with how much force. So it can increase your blood pressure if it increases the intensity of the contraction. Okay? Another important portion is for the respiratory system, and so it helps control, notice, the pace, how quickly you breathe, or if you slow down, like where's your rate of breathing. And so we did that kind of stuff last week in lab with the respiratory system. It's kind of did you guys enjoy that lab as much as you can enjoy a lab? Kind of the activities. It's neat to see the volumes and the rates and how those can change depending on what you're doing. Okay, so then number 2, you also have sensory nuclei, so receiving sensory information, and motor nuclei, so gray matter that is going to send information out to an effector. So motor nuclei is typically skeletal muscle. It's going to affect skeletal muscle and glands, for example. And so these are involved with the cranial nerves. And then it is also a relay station for the sensory and motor information. So just as a reminder, sensory and motor nuclei and relay for cranial nerves, not for everything, for cranial nerves. Okay, then we move to another portion of the brainstem, the pons, and this is just superior or above the medulla oblongata. And so important things about the pons. It links all these wonderful things together. Well, you don't have to know. I mean, if we just look here at this picture again, if we just remember the lowest portion of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, the middle portion is the pons, and then we have a little portion above that called the midbrain, and then a little portion above that, that's our diencephalon. Just basically the general regions of the brainstem. That's just the general regions. Again, but you will not be identifying anything from that picture. So just kind of be familiar with how they're related to each other. So, again, sensory and motor nuclei. So gray matter that processes sensory information and sends out responses, motor nuclei. For cranial nerves, what are these nuclei, these balls of gray matter involved in? They're very important in respiratory control. And so we'll find that there are multiple places that respiration has control centers for. And so it's not just one place, it's multiple places that have effects on respiration or even heart rate or other functions. So notice, look, here's reticular formation. Woohoo! So it extends upwards into the pons, and so it definitely has an effect on respiration. And so continuing on with what it can do within the pons, so it can moderate or modify the functions that the medulla oblongata sends for respiration. So basically we could say that the pons trumps the medulla oblongata as far as control over respiration. Okay? So medulla oblongata it controls it, and if necessary, the pons can kind of step in and change it if it needs to. Respiratory rate or other effects on respiration. Okay, so, and then we also have portions of the pons where we're relaying information to and from the cerebellum. So not the cerebrum, from the cerebellum. So you kind of have a relay area there, just from the pons to the cerebellum. And then, of course, you're still having ascending and descending nerve tracts, and also transverse, which is going back and forth from one portion of the pons to another. Okay, moving up one step higher from the pons, we have the region we call the midbrain. And the midbrain, we're familiar with it, but we're familiar with it by different names. Okay? And so the mesencephalon, which is the midbrain portion of the brainstem, basically contains several structures that we're already familiar with. So, for example, we can call it the tectum. So it's 4 nuclei or groups of gray matter that we call combined the corpora quadrumina. Remember that? So part of the corpora quadrumina, if we break it up even further, we have 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. So that gives us a total of 4, and that's why we have that prefix here, quad. So referring to the fact that you have 4 nuclei of gray matter within that area. And so what does the superior colliculi do? What is it involved with? Look at this, visual reflexes. So we did a lab. Remember when you spin a person in a chair and we were looking for a reflex with their eyes? going back and forth. So that's an example of a visual reflex. Also receives information from inferior colliculi, etc. Okay, but the more specific thing about that is visual reflexes. Then you have two inferior colliculi, which are involved with hearing. So you receive information from the cranial nerves, the vestibular cochlear nerve, for example, passes through that region, and it helps with the processing of hearing. Okay, so inferior colliculi, superior colliculi. Notice in this orange kind of portion here, showing the reticular formation. So it reaches up into the midbrain just a tiny bit, but it continues down further into the medulla oblongata. So it is a long, skinny group of gray matter, group of cell bodies. Okay, then also the cerebral peduncles. Where is our cerebral peduncle? On the sides. Okay, and you can even see like these lines representing nerve tracts or nerve fibers. Okay, and so these are just descending nerve fibers from the cerebrum coming down, and they are going to desiccate, cross over in the medulla oblongata. Okay. So more on the reticular formation. This is the third time we've mentioned the reticular formation. And so this picture is nice because it does show you exactly kind of how long this structure is. Or does it bend? Does it bend? Does it go this way? Nope, that's a different one. I don't want to confuse you. So the reticular formation extends almost to the base of your medulla oblongata and extends upwards. So notice up here, this is part of it as well. It continues. You just can't see it all. It extends upwards into the pons. And so, as it says, it's just scattered throughout the brainstem. It passes through several regions. Okay, next section, the diencephalon, which is the highest or the most superior of the four portions of the brainstem. Or maybe it's actually the connection from the brainstem to the cerebrum. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. So components of the diencephalon, thalamus. We've seen the thalamus. Then there's a subthalamus, an epithalamus, and then a hypothalamus. Okay, so here this is a cross-section of a human brain. It's pretty similar. Of course, we don't have like a rainbow color of nuclei down here, but this represents the hypothalamus. And then right at the base is where you would have the infundibulum, the stalk, that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Okay, and so, where's my chain? All right. The thalamus is not something, if you remember when we dissected the brain, it didn't have distinct little structures that made it look separate, but it is a region of that brain, so right there at the base, connected to the infundibulum. And then when we looked at the brain, when we dissected, we saw that round portion, which is part of the thalamus, which connects the right and left, basically hemispheres of the thalamus. So the thalamus, you have two sides to it, which is kind of neat. And then the other two parts, we really didn't use these terms of epithalamus and subthalamus, but the epithalamus includes two neat little structures. So we have what's called the habenula and the pineal body, or as we learned it in lab, the pineal gland. Do you remember what the pineal gland helps with or secretes? Melatonin. And so what does melatonin help us with? Yeah, it helps us regulate our sleep-wake cycle. I take melatonin every night because I don't know how about you guys. I am a chronic insomniac from like probably when I was like a baby my whole life. So taking that kind of helps with the rhythm of being tired at a certain time of the day, and it helps with the sleeping. It doesn't knock you out like drugs will, but it helps you feel naturally tired at a certain time every day if you take it at the same time every day. So the epithalamus is where we find our pineal gland, kind of right there. We're not going to talk too much about the habenula, but that is portion of the epithalamus. And then the last section is the subthalamus. So if we take that word apart, sub means below. So this is a portion of the diencephalon that's found below the thalamus. So if we actually follow this little line, we have this bracket here. And so this little region that's below the thalamus and above the hypothalamus, this little tiny band essentially, or this little rectangle I'm drawing for you, that would be the subthalamus, okay? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the thalamus. I am not going to expect you to identify the different little nuclei within the thalamus. Don't need to know that. The only thing I do want you to know is here on the slide, of course. But first of all, look at sensory information is traveling from the spinal cord, and it has its synapses there before it heads up to the cerebrum. So this is an area where information is coming in and then is going up to our brain to be processed. So we have a synapse there. And that synapse is going to be between two neurons, so we're going to be using neurotransmitters at that point. Okay, so three important little knots of gray matter I want to mention to you. So remember, nucleus is a knot or ball of gray matter in the central nervous system. I want to be clear about that. When it's in the peripheral nervous system, do you remember what we called gray matter outside the central nervous system? We had a different name for it. Ganglion. Yeah. So in the central nervous system, we say nucleus. If we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, we call it a ganglion, because let me ask you this. Where is it more common for you to find little portions of gray matter? In where? In the central nervous system, in the brain, essentially. That's where we're going to find a lot of that gray matter. In the brainstem, we've talked about this little nuclei, like the reticular formation is basically a group of cell bodies and unmyelinated nerve fibers. But it's very rare to find gray matter outside of the central nervous system, and when we do, we refer to those portions of gray matter as ganglion. But if we're talking about knots or portions of gray matter within the brain, we call those nuclei. Okay, so there's three here that I wanted to kind of point out to you. The medial genticulate nucleus is involved with auditory information, so processing what we're hearing. Okay, so medial. The lateral nucleus is involved with visual information, and then a ventral posterior, woohoo, is most other sensory information. So the type of question I could ask you about the thalamus is, I may not ask you the specific name of the nuclei, but knowing that there is a nuclei within the thalamus involved with auditory information or involved with visual or mostly basically sensory information. Okay, so having a good idea of what's the thalamus involved with, that's what I want you to know. There is also areas of motor function, so controlling body movements. You again don't need to know which nuclei are involved. Also, you have a portion that's attached or involved with the limbic system. The limbic system is involved with emotions. Okay, and there'll be more of this later on in this chapter. So there is a portion of the thalamus that's involved with our mood. And we'll talk more about other things in the limbic system and what they affect. Also emotion. And I can't see the last little line down there. I apologize. I don't know what it says. So kind of the functions within the thalamus is what I want to know. What I want you to know. Much more than the actual name of the nuclei. So functions that the thalamus is involved with, okay? Moving to the epithalamus, looking a little bit more. So just talking about these two little structures, okay? Our habenular nucleus, or as you see it here, they call it the habenula. I know it's, but it actually is called the habenular nucleus. And then our pineal gland, we've kind of talked about that. So we know it has an effect on our sleep-wake cycle. We know, so it helps with our biological clock. It secretes, I can't believe it doesn't say it here on the slide. What does it secrete that helps with the whole sleepiness and biological clock? Melatonin. You better know that, okay? I will ask you about melatonin. And look at this one. This one right here. We're not sure, but it may play a role in the onset of puberty. Interesting, right? And just as a side note, in the last 20 years of my life, I know I'm so old, I've noticed that the age at which people are entering puberty gets younger and younger and younger. And there's a lot of talk about, oh, maybe it's the growth hormones that are in the foods, or maybe it has to do with genetically modified food, or maybe, it's an adaptation. I don't know what it is, but it's happening. You guys notice that? Okay, I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, but I'm super curious about the age at which you kind of entered the puberty fun phase. So, okay, I'll just mention a year, like 10, and if it was you, I just want to kind of get an idea. Are you guys comfortable with that? If you don't know, okay, for ladies, it's usually when you start your period. For men, it's usually when your voice starts to change, hair grows, that kind of fun stuff. Huh? All the fun things, all the hormones that are released, all the moodiness and stuff that happens. Okay, so I'll tell you, when I was a teenager or when I was in junior high, the average age for girls entering puberty was 13. Okay, how about this? Anybody feel that they entered puberty before the age of 13? You can just do a look. Okay. After 13? Lucky. Nice. Okay. I have a friend whose daughter is 9, and she's already growing body hair, like pubic hair and stuff, and they're just waiting for her to start her period at the age of 9. And I just feel so sorry for that girl. That is early, but that is becoming more and more normal. That's eating into your childhood. You know what I'm saying? So there's a trend with puberty and the onset starting much earlier throughout time. If we look back to the early 1900s, it was more common for a young lady to begin her first period at the age of 17. That was the common age, 16 or 17. No joke. And so over the last 100 years, it has steadily gone down in age. Why? There's a lot of theories. There's a lot of theories about it. Okay, but just remember, the pineal gland can play a role in the onset of puberty, but there are many other factors that also play a role. Okay, so that's not the only thing. Habenular nucleus, this is kind of fun. Emotional and visceral response to odors. Okay, so if you smell something, have you ever smelled something and it gives you a good memory? Yeah, maybe makes you feel a little sad or a little happy or whatever other emotion you may feel. That is being processed through that habenular nucleus. The other one, visceral response to odors. What do you think that means? You smell something, visceral, remember it's organs. So, huh? Yeah, that's a very good example. You smell some really great food at the cafeteria and it makes you hungry. That's a visceral response. Or, let's say you're passing by a cattle farm and you smell that manure that's piling up. You know, I told you that story before. Well, just imagine a bunch of manure and you're close by to it. What kind of possible visceral response may you have to that? Or even worse, dirty diapers. The gagging or the the gross reflex kind of response. So habenular nucleus is kind of a fun one. I think it's a fun one. There's one that's also similar to it. Guys, pay attention to this. So there is one other structure we're going to talk about that has similar functions as the habenular nucleus, and that is the mammillary bodies. Okay? So you want to make sure you distinguish between those two. Mam, two M's, I think. Yeah. So make sure you compare and contrast what's going on with the habenular nucleus and the mammillary body so you know the difference well. Okay. So speaking of mammillary bodies, right there. These are olfactory reflexes and emotional responses to odor. So emotional response to odor, both of them do that. So both the mammillary bodies and the habenular nucleus will give us emotional responses to odor. The habenular nucleus will give us visceral responses to the odors we smell, where maybe it's hunger or like upset stomach or you could. But then with mammillary bodies, we have olfactory reflexes. So a reflex, is that under your conscious control? Like we've been talking about reflex arcs in the previous chapter, and usually a reflex happens before it even gets to your brain for processing. So it happens before you even are aware of it, in a sense. And so you will get olfactory reflexes. So for example, if you're changing a dirty diaper, an olfactory reflex would be like, to back off, for example. The visceral one, the previous slide, could even cause vomiting, for example. So make sure we know that the differences there. They are very similar. The infundibulum, this is connecting our hypothalamus to our pituitary gland. And so unfortunately, we didn't get to see this when we did dissect the brains because they just ripped the pituitary glands off. But you did see the little hole where the infundibulum should be. So it's this lovely little stalk here, this little portal, essentially, from our hypothalamic region here down to our pituitary gland. And so the infundibulum, information that it receives, look at input from your viscera, so your organs, taste receptors, limbic system, so limbic system's emotions, okay, nipples, external genitalia, and prefrontal cortex. So there is some connection to some of your sexual organs, okay, which is interesting, and emotions. And so when we talk about the limbic system, the connection with the limbic system and some of the sex organs will make more sense when we talk about the limbic system. Okay. Let me see. Do I want to talk? Okay, so these efferent fibers, and I'm over-pronunciating that. Let's see if we can see these here, if I can highlight the fibers. So you see these little lines, they're in purple, which is not helpful. Let's see, what could I do? I can make it in yellow. So these lines everywhere that are connecting different regions together. You get all these little fibers everywhere. And so it helps, so even these efferent fibers into the pituitary gland. This portion is your posterior pituitary. That is under the control of the nervous system. It will secrete neurohormones, okay? That's something that is important, even though it's not written down. I'll try to write it, except for, of course, this thing is neurohormones. It's directly connected to the hypothalamus. That's what those efferent fibers are for. It's a direct connection, okay? But then we have our anterior pituitary, and that releases actual hormones like luteinizing hormone or oxytocin or growth hormone, a lot of the hormones that we'll talk about in a chapter or two. Okay, so these two regions, anterior and posterior pituitary, are different, and those efferent fibers, especially from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, is important. And notice, what is it controlling? So things like swallowing, which is a visceral important response that you need to have. I'm going to finish the slide. It's only 10:49. So notice it's controlling cranial nerves that are involved with this stuff. So it's not directly connected to the medulla oblongata, for example. And right here, in bold and highlighted, these efferent fibers and the connection we have between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Note, important in regulation of mood, emotion, sexual pleasure, satiation, like feeling full after you've eaten, and rage. And so those things are part of the limbic system. So there is a definite connection. Okay? We will start on slide 14 on Friday. We are going to have this done, and we're going to have our quiz on Wednesday on this chapter. Okay? Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful day.